Good evening and welcome to This Week in Turkey. The number of registered Syrian refugees currently residing in Turkey has reached nearly 3 million. With Syrians comprising more than 90% of the country's total refugee population, their integration to the Turkish labor market continues being a divisive issue for the Turkish public.
Since the Syrian civil war broke out, Turkey has been welcoming numerous Syrian refugees. With 2.7 million registered individuals, Syrians in Turkey today correspond to about more than 90% of the country's total refugee population. More than 260,000 Syrian refugees are residing in 26 camps in 10 cities at southeastern Turkey. However, those who reside in refugee camps constitute only about 9% of this population. Let's have a look at the legal status of Syrian refugees in Turkey. Turkey is signatory to the 1951 Geneva Convention, the key international legal document that defines the framework for refugee status and rights of those granted the status. However, Turkey signed Geneva Convention with a geographical limitation, meaning that it only grants refugee status to asylum seekers fleeing from Europe. In 2014, Turkey ratified the temporary protection law that regulates the status of refugees coming into the country en masse. Hence, the legal status of Syrians are regulated under the temporary protection regime, providing a safeguard against the return of individuals to Syria against their will, and guaranteeing access to the fundamental rights and entitlements, including healthcare services, education, and social assistance. However, the temporary protection regime leaves these basic rights to the discretion of government and deprives refugees from full refugee rights recognized by international conventions. Although temporary protection grants access to basic services, there is still much to be done. Among these Syrian refugees, there are 900,000 school-age Syrian children, of which only 400,000 have been able to enroll in school. Furthermore, according to the World Health Organization, the number of women and children currently amount to 60% of the total arrivals, and the age distribution of the population suggests an increase of specific health needs and tailored responses. In particular, pregnant women, breastfeeding women, and unvaccinated babies require tailored responses to their specific needs. Another important issue to be considered is integration to the labor market. In Turkey, Syrian refugees are mostly employed informally in low-skilled jobs. The approximate number of Syrians working informally is 400,000. Since January 2016, Syrians under temporary protection are able to apply for work permits. But in the past year, only 13,298 Syrians were granted work permits, mainly due to low application numbers. In July 2016, President Erdogan stated that 300,000 Syrians with their families qualifying for their educational or technical skills will be granted Turkish citizenship. The debate around naturalization of Syrians still continues, and the details of the process have yet to be clarified.
Our guest via Skype tonight is Mr. Omar Kadkoy. Mr. Kadkoy is an analyst for the Ankara-based think tank TEPAV, and his work focuses extensively on the integration of the Syrian refugees into the Turkish labor market. Hello, Mr. Kadkoy, and welcome. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Thank you for having me.
Mr. Kadkoy, I'd like to start by asking you about the legal status of the Syrian refugees living in Turkey. They were first welcomed under the rather ambiguous status of guests, and this has changed later on, but still, right now, the legal confusion persists. So how do you think the status issue is affecting the lives of the many, almost 3 million Syrians living in Turkey?
Yeah. Thank you for having me, first of all, on your show. Mm-hmm. And I would say that the legal confusion existed prior to 2014. That is when, as you said, Syrians were defined as guests in Turkey. Mm-hmm. But after 2014, the legal framework and status is clear. If any confusion exists still, that would be not because of the ambiguities in the legal framework, but it could be related to the failure of communication or the failure to communicate the legal framework to the relevant stakeholders. And this legal status, today we have 2.9 million Syrians registered as foreigners under temporary protection sheds a very positive effect on their lives. Because as we know, Syrians are spread all over Turkey, and through this legal status, they have access to the basic services such as health and education. Most importantly, when Syrians and if Syrians land an employment opportunity, their employers cannot apply for a work permit on their behalf unless they have been registered under temporary protection for the last 6 months. So overall, this legal status as foreigners under temporary protection has a positive impact on Syrians living in Turkey, I would say.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kadkoy. Now I'd like to focus more on your working area in Tepov, which focuses extensively on the labor market dynamics of Syrians living in Turkey. So in a nutshell, how would you evaluate the economic integration of these Syrians living in Turkey? To be more precise, what do they take from and what do they give to the Turkish economy?
Right. When we talk about the labor integration of Syrians into Turkish labor market, we have to keep in mind 2 points. One, the regional concentration of Syrians in the southeast region of Turkey, where the unemployment rates were higher even prior to the influx of Syrians than the national rate, means that we cannot have a one-size-fits-all labor integration model in all of the regions. The second point here would be it depends on what group of Syrians are we talking about, because the vast majority of Syrians in Turkey are dependent on aid or depleting their personal savings, which they brought when they moved to Turkey. So we need to sustain their contribution to the economy. If we want to do so, we have to achieve 2 points. One, a legal framework, which is a 1-year-old decree that paved the way for Syrians to access the Turkish labor market. And if you look at the numbers of Ministry of Labor and Social Security, you would see that by the end of 2016, some 13,000 Syrians were granted work permits. And by the end of the first 2 months of 2017, another 5,000 Syrians got work permits. So this is a progress, albeit a slow one. And if we want to turn the wheels faster, we need a coherent cooperation to create inclusive job opportunities. This requires cooperation between international NGOs, multinational companies, local SMEs, and public stakeholders to have a coherent framework to answer the endeavor of creating inclusive job opportunities. And also, we have a second group of Syrians. I'm talking about the Syrian entrepreneurs. This group of Syrians, they are dependent on themselves and they generate income for themselves. And since 2011, almost 6,000 Syrian companies were established in Turkey. The estimated seed capital of these companies is at 1.1 billion Turkish liras, and half of this number, or half of these companies, are located in Istanbul, and the remaining majority are located in the southeast region of Turkey. So I would say if these companies are properly supported, they could serve as a vessel for Syrians to achieve self-resilience, and they can also create job opportunities for locals themselves. After all, we have to remember one thing. Turkey is not Lebanon nor Jordan, where INGOs execute their humanitarian schemes as they deem fit. Also, Turkey is not Germany in the sense of the institutions, the public institutions in Turkey, they do not have the long-standing experience of integrating refugees or immigrants. Turkey is an upper middle income country, and it hosts the largest population of refugees since the Second World War. And I would say this is unprecedented in the region.
Thank you, Mr. Kadkoy. My next question is about the rather divisive issue of granting citizenship status to some of the Syrians living in Turkey. So what, in your opinion, are the advantages and disadvantages associated with the citizenship issue for Syrians living in Turkey?
Yeah, this is one of the most debated topics, I would say, alongside the integration of labor market regarding Syrians in Turkey. But jumping from the temporary protection status to granting to Syrians citizenship, Turkish citizenship, is a big jump, I would say, because if we are to assume that today we can give the 2.9 million Syrians Turkish citizenship, does that mean they will have jobs tomorrow? I wouldn't say so, because, you know, the barriers of labor market integration would stand still. I'm talking about language barrier, recognition of skills, and the demands of the labor market. So after all, if the ongoing debates I would say would render this debate and polarize it more and more. But definitely, and either way, Syrians are grateful, as myself, to be in Turkey for the open door policy in providing safe haven for all of the Syrians. And definitely the generosity of both the government of Turkey and the citizens of Turkey will not be forgotten.
Thank you, Mr. Kadkoy. We'll keep you on the line, but we'll move on with the next video now. Turkey's refugee deal with the European Union continues to be criticized by international organizations. More than 61,000 migrants and asylum seekers are currently stranded in the Greek islands and mainland Greece.
After the massive influx of refugees from Turkey to European Union countries in 2015, Turkey and the EU signed a controversial refugee deal in March 2016. The deal, long criticized by human rights organizations, aimed to curb the irregular migration flow into Europe by stipulating the return of all those irregular migrants arriving to the Greek islands via Turkey back to Turkey. However, European countries also guaranteed that they will resettle one Syrian asylum seeker for every Syrian refugee readmitted by Turkey. In return, the EU promised visa liberalization for Turkish citizens, progress in the accession process, and an additional 3 billion euros to be used for the needs of the refugees in Turkey. Until now, the EU has allocated a total of 505 million euros to Turkish government. At the time of the signing of the agreement, the Turkish government announced that it had spent over 11 billion euros to provide assistance to refugees since the beginning of the Syrian civil war. With the implementation of the agreement, the numbers of the irregular migrants arriving from Turkey to the EU have considerably dropped. In 2015, over 850,000 people reached Greek islands by boat from Turkey's western coast. The majority of these refugees were Syrians, Iraqis, and Afghans. In 2016, this number fell to less than 180,000, with only less than 27,000 crossings after the implementation of the deal on March 20th. Of the more than 26,000 refugees, only 865 were returned to Turkey. The deal drew criticism from international organizations on the basis of its recognition of Turkey as a safe third country where asylum seekers can be sent back. These institutions drew attention to obstacles to registration and access to education, employment, and healthcare services experienced by refugees in Turkey. However, it's important to note that none of the 865 refugees were sent back to Turkey on the basis of the Safe Third Country regulation, but because their applications were rejected or they had decided to withdraw their application. There are still more than 61,000 migrants and asylum seekers stranded in the Greek islands and mainland Greece, waiting to receive a response to their applications.
Mr. Kadkoy, as we've just watched in the news clip, the refugee deal between the EU and Turkey is mostly criticized for the disadvantages that it's expected to cause for the lives of the many refugees. And what is your evaluation of this deal? Who wins and who loses?
I would say it's slightly unfair to define it who's winning as in who's winning or losing, because definitely drowning in the Aegean is not winning. The EU-Turkey deal was constructed to save the lives of those trying to attempt to cross the Aegean, and in return, EU pledged to help Turkey to help Turkey in hosting refugees. So, in that sense, one of the a flagship of the Facility for Refugees in Turkey program is called the Emergency Social Safety Net. This flagship was launched in 2016, September 2016, and it aims to help and assist 1 million refugees during the course of 2017. Here I would like to emphasize on the following point. Under this specific scheme, which has a budget of 348 million euros, it will reach not only Syrians, but other refugees as well in Turkey, such as Iraqis and Afghanis, and other nationalities, of course. So, according to the EU, and by the end of February, there were 250,000 refugees who benefited from monthly cash grants under this flagship. But I also can understand that the EU-Turkey deal is often criticized by especially human rights organizations and similar NGOs. And I would say this is because of the overcapacity and the backlog on Greek islands. So compared to the size of the Aegean flow prior to the EU-Turkey deal, I would say the number is small and could be ironed out easily. Unfortunately, the fact that it hasn't been ironed out somehow says there is lack of coordination between EU, Greek, and Turkish authorities on that. But we also should not forget that the EU did not disavow from accepting or resettling more refugees. We all remember Merkel's last visit to Ankara, when she said that Germany is committed to taking 500 refugees per month. And I would also like to say that similar deals are constructed with other countries as well, not only Turkey. We have a similar deal with Jordan, and there might be in process deals as well, or like deals in process with the sub-Saharan African countries as well.
Mr. Kadkoy, thank you very much for your comments and for joining us tonight.
Thank you for having me.
No problem. Now moving on with our next video. A very hot topic in Turkey this week was a news story published by Turkey's flagship daily newspaper, Hürriyet. The news story and its title has sparked harsh criticism both by the government and the military.
The news article entitled "Unease at Military Headquarters," filed by Hürriyet's Ankara bureau chief Hande Fırat, was focusing on how the General Staff, the highest military body in the country, evaluated the criticism and speculation directed at the Turkish armed forces following last year's failed coup attempt. The news article also claimed that last week's end to the headscarf ban in the military Chief Hulusi Akar's foreign visits with Erdogan and his recent visit to the Kardak Islets in the Aegean Sea have attracted criticism from certain circles within the military. However, the headline alleging there is an unease at the country's military headquarters angered President Erdogan.
Çok açık net söylüyorum.
I tell you straight, the headline showed rudeness, a lack of character. Neither the newspaper's management nor the staff have the right to write such a headline, Erdogan told reporters on Tuesday. Following Erdogan's comments, the Turkish military also criticized the report. The military issued a statement and said the report was unfounded and ill-intentioned. We regret efforts to blur the agenda with allegation and defamation at a time when the Euphrates Shield operation in northern Syria is progressing successfully, suggesting that there are problems between the Turkish armed forces and the government distorts the issue, the military said on Tuesday. After the harsh criticisms voiced by President Erdogan and the military, Hürriyet issued a statement on its webpage and said the report was based completely on an institutional briefing by the Turkish General Staff. The statement continues as follows. It didn't cross our minds that such a meaning would be attributed to that headline. Such an intention is absolutely out of the question. Even if that was not the intention, the unease at military headquarters headline can be seen as an editorial mistake that goes beyond its purpose. For that, we are sorry. Within the same day, Sedat Ergin, the editor-in-chief of Hürriyet, has been dismissed from his role days after the paper published a news article. And lastly, Tolga Tanış, Washington correspondent of Hürriyet for the last 7 years, who has been recently dismissed from his role, severed his connections with Hürriyet.
Turkey continues with its Operation Euphrates Shield in northern Syria. In a bold statement yesterday, Turkish Foreign Minister Mevlut Çavuşoğlu emphasized the Turkish government's discontent with their ally support for the Kurdish YPG.
The Euphrates Shield, Turkey's ongoing operation in northern Syria, continues at full steam. Recent developments in northern Syria are pitting the Turkish armed forces against the People's Protection Units, YPG, the military wing of the Syrian Kurdish Democratic Union Party. The Manbij Military Council said on Thursday that they would cede several western villages of the city to the regime forces as part of a deal brokered by the regime's ally Russia to avoid conflict with Turkey. The Manbij Military Council announces that we agreed with Russia to hand over villages on the front line with Euphrates Shield to the border guards of the Syrian state, the group said. Besides, the Euphrates Shield attacked our forces today, and the clashes are ongoing, said Shervan Dervish, the spokesman for the Manbij Military Council, which is part of the Syrian Democratic Forces. On the same day, Ankara responded to the Manbij Military Council's statements in a bold tone. According to the statement made by Foreign Minister Mevlut Çavuşoğlu, Turkey will strike if they do not withdraw from Manbij, a former bastion of the ISIS that has been taken over predominantly by Kurdish forces. We do not want any of our allies to stand with terrorist groups. We stated earlier that Turkey will hit the YPG unless they withdraw from Manbij, he said. Turkey regards the PYD and the YPG as terrorist organizations due to their links to the Kurdistan Workers' Party, PKK. But the US sees them as reliable partners in the fight against the ISIS in northern Syria. Gönül Tol, the founding director of the Washington-based Middle East Institute's Center for Turkish Studies, commented on the ongoing tensions between Turkey and the Kurdish forces for Medyascope.
In Moscow, an advisor of Erdogan said that the operation in Syria will be finished once they take Manbij. This seems really difficult to me. We have seen how difficult the capture of Elbap has been. The Turkish media portrays this as a victory, but the Elbap operation has shown the limits of the power of the Turkish army and the Free Syrian Army supported by Turkey. Recently, we spoke with a Pentagon official and he said that they consider the Elbap operation as a mediocre one. For him, one of the reasons of its mediocrity is the absence of army officials who know the region and who have been cooperating with the US for a long time. These officials have left their positions. He also added that Turks keep coming to Washington to try to convince the US to capture Raqqa with Arabs backed by the Turkish army. However, the army official says such an army does not exist. He calls it the ghost army of Erdogan. An operation in Manbij is not supported by the US. CENTCOM shared a photograph in the social media and tweeted that PYD fighters are ready for war. But war with whom? There is no ISIS in that city. So they will defend themselves against Turkey.
The tension between Turkey and Germany keeps escalating after the imprisonment of journalist Deniz Yücel, a German citizen. According to the statement made by the German foreign minister, German-Turkish relations are currently facing one of the greatest challenges in recent times.
Deniz Yücel, correspondent for the German newspaper Die Welt, was taken into custody on February 14th in Istanbul. After being interrogated by a prosecutor, Yücel was detained for an indefinite period. He has been charged of terrorist propaganda and inciting hatred. Yücel has written several articles which criticized the Turkish government's treatment of the Kurds in Turkey. Activists, politicians, and journalists in several German, Austrian, and Swiss cities have demonstrated against the arrest of Yücel. Many politicians, including 2 German-Turkish members of parliament, and journalists gathered on Tuesday in front of the Turkish embassy in Berlin to protest the arrest. German newspapers spared their first pages in order to support Deniz Yücel and to protest his imprisonment. Yücel's arrest was also widely protested on social media with the hashtag #FreeDeniz. In a handwritten note, which was published by the German newspaper Die Welt, Deniz Yücel explained that the conditions of his detention had improved markedly since his transfer to prison from a police cell. He said, "It may sound strange, but I feel as though I have won back a little bit of my freedom. Daylight, fresh air, real food, tea and Nescafe, smoking, newspapers, a real bed." Germany's Chancellor Angela Merkel criticized the move in a statement as bitter and disappointing and called it disproportionate. The German government demanded Yücel's immediate release and wants consular access to him and 5 other German citizens detained in Turkey since the failed coup attempt of July 2016. Germany has also summoned the Turkish ambassador in Berlin. On Thursday, the German town of Gaggenau withdrew permission for the scheduled speech of Turkish Justice Minister Bekir Bozdağ, who aims to promote a yes campaign for the upcoming constitutional referendum in Turkey. The reason was declared as security deficit. Bozdağ protested the decision and cancelled his meeting with his German counterpart Heiko Maas. Shortly before Bozdağ arrived in Germany, Maas said, "Whoever claims freedom of opinion for themselves should also ensure the right to freedom of the press." The German city Cologne also withdrew official permission for an event in which the Turkish economy minister Nihat Zeybekci would address the German Turks. After cancelling the speeches of Turkish politicians, Turkey has summoned the German ambassador in Ankara to express the disapproval of the Turkish government.
A 1943 novel by the Turkish writer Sabahattin Ali is now out in English. Translated by Maureen Freely, the novel is now a bestseller in the United States.
A young Turkish man named Raif arrives in 1920s Berlin. Ignoring his soap manufacturing business, he spends his days learning German and keeps busy reading books at night. He explores the city's parks, its wide streets, its museums and art galleries. One evening at a gallery, he stands mesmerized in front of a painting where a young woman was dressed in a fur coat. Day after day, he returns to stare at the same painting. One evening, drunk and out in the town, he sees the woman in the painting standing in front of his eyes. Her name is Maria, and the life of the young man is transformed. "All my life, I'd kept my heart closed," Raif said. "I had never known love, but now, all at once, the doors are flown open." This is the synopsis of Madonna in a Fur Coat, a once-forgotten Turkish novel written nearly 75 years ago. These days, it has become a bestseller. Published in 1943 and written by Sabahattin Ali, a leftist intellectual who was jailed for his political writings, the book's newfound success has become a rare point of common cultural experience for Turkey. Maureen Freely, who translated the book for the first time into English last year, says it is read loved and wept over by men and women of all ages, but most of all by young adults. If he were alive today, Sabahattin Ali would be shocked to see Madonna had become a bestseller, his daughter Filiz Ali has said in a recent interview she gave to New York Times. As a devoted communist and an outspoken intellectual, the novels, stories, poems and articles he wrote repeatedly got him thrown into jail. The same thing are happening all over again, but much worse, says Filiz Ali, referring to the current arrests of journalists. Madonna in a Fur Coat has been widely read in Arabic, French, German, and now it can also be read in English. And in Turkey, it seems that this bestseller will continue to be read and loved by readers of all ages.
Now we'll hear our friend Elif Akbıyık's interview with Turkish musical critic Mehmet Tez about the indie music scene in Turkey. Tez believes that the recent success of local indie bands is partly a result of the reluctance of foreign artists to perform in Turkey due to security reasons.
Bands from other countries are not being fair to Turkey. There is not a constant atmosphere of terror here. Life continues. You can still come here and give your concert, but there's a prejudice against Istanbul. I know that a lot has happened, but there were attacks in Paris too. Also, there hasn't been an attack in a concert venue in Turkey before. Actually, we can talk about a cultural distinction here. Foreign bands think that they are not wanted here. It was not like this 10 years ago. They were lowering the price to come here. I'm really sad about this, and they are not being fair. Elton John and Sting came to Antalya but not to Istanbul. Agencies and managers are exploiting the situation. They raise the prices. There are financial concerns and calculations too. Nevertheless, independent local artists' growing presence in concert venues and festivals is an important success for Turkish indie music.
Now let's take a quick look at what's on in Istanbul next week.
Recently, Ziba Pop's Medyascope has been filling a much-needed gap in the city's electronic music scene. Ziba's party series, 100 Degrees, is once again on point this weekend with DJ Murat Uncuoğlu and his selection of quality house music. The party will kick off tonight at 10:30. Iconic Broadway musical West Side Story is in town. The musical's Istanbul visit marks the season's biggest performance in terms of international popularity. West Side Story is on stage at Zorlu PSM until March 18th. Today is the first day of Selma Gürbüz's new exhibition, Carnivalesque. Gürbüz is well known for her dreamlike compositions and mythological aesthetics. This time her figures speak, fight, dance, and even literally move off the canvas as in her three-dimensional paintings. The exhibition is on view at Galeri Rampa in Beşiktaş until April 8th.
We now leave you to the tunes of Dengin Ceyhan, a young Turkish pianist who was released last week following his arrest for insulting President Erdogan. Thank you for tuning in and see you again next Friday at 9 p.m. Bye.